All right, so get ready because we're about to take a deep dive into some pretty radical ideas about faith.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we're going to be looking at this presentation that Stephen Johnson gave
Okay.
at the Freedom Outpost. And let me tell you, he does not hold back.
Sounds intense.
Yeah, he's really challenging us to think differently about, well, what it even means to be a follower of Christ these days.
Yeah, especially in today's world, it feels like things are changing so fast.
Exactly.
And the old ways of doing things, maybe they don't quite cut it anymore.
You know, it's like he's saying we need a new playbook.
A new playbook, okay.
And he uses some pretty striking metaphors to get his point across.
Okay, I like metaphors. Give me a good metaphor.
Okay, well, get this. He compares a new dynamic model of church to an aircraft carrier.
Whoa, okay.
And then he talks about, get this, the 1% of God's army.
The 1%, huh?
Yeah, the ones who are truly willing to step out in radical faith.
So he's saying there's like this elite force within the larger body of believers.
Exactly, the ones who are really committed to pushing the boundaries.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What else does he say about this 1%?
Well, that's what I found so interesting about Johnson's message.
Yeah.
You know, it's how he brings together these seemingly, I don't know, random ideas.
Yeah.
Biblical narratives, military metaphors, even personal challenges, like this sense of urgency.
Yeah.
It's like a call to action, you know?
Okay.
He's really rejecting this idea that faith has to be safe and predictable and comfortable.
Yeah, that kind of lukewarm, watered-down faith that doesn't really demand anything from you.
Right. And he's not shy about calling out what he sees as the problems with traditional church models.
So what's he proposing instead?
He's advocating for something, I don't know, more real,
Okay.
more raw, a kind of faith that embraces risk and challenges the way things are and really leans into the miraculous.
So like a less structured, more experience-based kind of faith.
Exactly. And I think this really resonates with a lot of people who are just kind of disillusioned with the whole traditional church scene, you know?
Yeah.
People who are longing for something more, something deeper, something that actually prepares them to, I don't know, live out their faith in a meaningful way.
I hear that.
Okay, so going back to that aircraft carrier metaphor, that really jumped out at me.
Yeah, that's a pretty vivid image.
Can you break that down a bit more? Like, what is he contrasting it with?
So it's really fascinating how he uses this image of the aircraft carrier to represent this mobile, adaptable, and really intensely focused faith community.
Okay.
Think about it. You know, an aircraft carrier, it's not just sitting still.
No.
It's on the move. It's constantly on the move. It's ready to deploy its forces wherever they're needed.
All right.
And landing on a carrier, that's not your average, you know, landing on a runway.
Yeah.
It takes an incredible amount of skill and courage and willingness to, I don't know, embrace the risk involved.
That's a good point, yeah. So when he compares this to a more traditional kind of stationary church model, what he's saying is we need a faith that's nimble and adaptable, that's ready to engage with the challenges of our time.
So not just hunkering down in our church buildings and waiting for the world to come to us.
Exactly. He's calling for a faith that's not afraid to move, to adapt, to push beyond what's considered normal or acceptable in religious circles.
And I think a lot of people are hungry for that, for something that's more dynamic and less predictable.
It's like he's saying if you want to be a part of God's elite force, you got to be willing to get out of your comfort zone.
Right.
And onto the deck of this aircraft carrier, you know where the stakes are higher, the challenges are greater, but the potential is also much greater.
The potential for impact.
Exactly.
He's not messing around here. He's not offering some kind of watered down, easy version of faith.
No, not at all.
He's calling for radical commitment,
Yeah.
a willingness to be different, to stand out, to embrace a life that might not always make sense to the rest of the world.
A life of purpose.
Exactly. And this brings us to that idea of being a 1%er in God's army.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit more.
So here's where Johnson really gets into the biblical roots of his message.
Yeah.
He talks about that story of Gideon.
Oh, yeah, where God whittles down this massive army to a small, dedicated force, the 300.
Exactly. The ones who are willing to fight against the odds.
Against all odds, yeah.
And it connects with other biblical narratives, like David and Goliath, right, where God uses the seemingly weak and insignificant to achieve his purposes.
It's like he's flipping the script on what we usually think of as strength and power.
Right.
True strength, in God's eyes, is not about outward appearances. It's about a heart that's fully surrendered to his will.
And that's willing to trust him, Even when it seems crazy.
And to step out in faith, even when the odds are stacked against you.
Which brings us back to that aircraft carrier metaphor.
Oh, okay. How so?
Because it's like he's saying, not everyone's made for this kind of faith, right? Just like not everyone can land a plane on an aircraft carrier.
It takes a special kind of person with a certain set of qualities, a willingness to embrace a different kind of journey.
So who are these 1%ers, according to Johnson?
What makes them tick?
Yeah, what makes them different?
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. He uses some, I don't know, unconventional terms to describe these folks.
Oh, okay, like what?
He calls them dog-like, distressed, even foolish.
Okay, dog-like.
I know, right? Before you think he's completely off the rails, let's break it down.
Okay, I'm all ears. Lay it on me.
All right, so the dog-like thing, he's referencing Gideon's selection process.
Okay.
You remember how God told Gideon to choose the men who lapped up the water like dogs?
Yeah.
Well, Johnson sees that as a symbol of like this eagerness, a willingness to, receive God's word and instructions with a sense of urgency, obedience.
Okay, like putting aside pride and just absorbing the truth.
Exactly. And he suggests that kind of hunger, that receptivity, it's essential for those who want to be part of God's, elite force.
They need to be all in.
All in, yeah.
Okay, so what about distressed and discontented? Those labels sound a bit, I don't know, more relatable.
Especially in the world today, right?
Yeah.
That one really struck a chord with me too. And Johnson connects it to the people who followed David, those who were fed up with the status quo, yearning for something more.
They were ready for a change, for a revolution.
Exactly. They were willing to step outside the established systems and embrace a new way of living, a new way of leading.
Okay.
And he argues that this kind of dissatisfaction, this yearning for something more, it's often a sign that God is calling us to something greater.
It's a sign that we're not meant to settle.
Not meant to settle for mediocrity or complacency. Yeah, it's a sign that we're made for more.
And that God has a bigger plan for us than we can imagine.
Exactly.
Okay, so he's saying that being a 1%er starts with this deep sense of discontent, a realization that there's got to be more to life than what we're currently experiencing.
And a willingness to step out in faith and pursue that more, even if it means leaving behind what's familiar or comfortable.
It's about embracing the journey, even when the destination is unclear.
Trusting that God will get you where you need to be.
Okay, now let's talk about that last quality, maybe the most thought-provoking one, being foolish.
Cool, huh?
What's the wisdom in that?
So he's drawing on the Apostle Paul here, specifically that passage in 1 Corinthians where Paul talks about how God uses the foolish things of the world to confound the wise.
Okay.
And he argues that that's still true today, that God often calls us to do things that just don't make sense from a worldly perspective.
To embrace paths that others might think are ridiculous or even dangerous?
Exactly, and to pursue goals that others might deem impossible.
Okay.
And Johnson suggests that God does this because he wants to show his power, to show that he's not limited by our limited thinking or our conventional wisdom.
It's like he's saying, I'm going to work through the ones who are willing to trust me, even when it looks crazy.
The ones who are willing to step out in faith, even when it seems foolish.
So it's a reminder that God's ways are higher than our ways, and that the path to true wisdom sometimes leads through what the world considers to be, well, foolishness.
Exactly.
Okay, so before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, can you give us a little sneak peek into what else Johnson covers in his presentation? What else should we be thinking about?
Oh, absolutely. So he delves deeper into these qualities of the 1%, giving real-life examples of how they play out in the lives of people who are truly answering God's call. He also introduces this really interesting concept of freedom outposts.
Freedom Outposts. Okay, I like that.
Yeah, which are these strategic spiritual centers that are designed to equip and mobilize God's people for, I don't know, a new era of spiritual warfare.
That sounds intense.
Yeah, and then he talks about something that I think is really important, the idea of embracing discomfort as a path to growth. That the most transformative experiences in our faith often happen when we're willing to step outside of our comfort zones, to face our fears, and to embrace the unknown.
So he's not offering a comfortable, easy faith.
No, not at all. He's calling us to something much deeper, much more demanding, but also much more rewarding.
So stay tuned, because we're about to unpack some powerful and I think challenging ideas about what it means to live a life of radical faith in today's world.
It's going to be a wild ride.
Okay, so we were talking